for Justice, we believe that awareness leads to action. So everything you can do where you live to help raise awareness could ultimately help rescue more victims of human trafficking. We need more people to be aware of the facts and of the signs, and to feel confident to report their concerns to an expert group like Hope for Justice. Traffickers do not discriminate based on gender, race, social demographic, immigration status, or economic status. No exact mold fits a victim. Anyone is at risk, but certain populations have a higher vulnerability risk.
Welcome to a general awareness training on human trafficking. My name is Richard Schoeberl. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with all of you today in regards to human trafficking. I think it's an extremely important topic as we move through this and migrate through this pandemic. I've got a short PowerPoint presentation. It may feel like you're taking a drink from a fire hydrant because it'll be a lot of information at once, but I promise we'll get through it. And then if you got questions at the end, obviously you can ask me questions at the end, but also too, I'll drop my email in the chat box, and you can feel free to email me and for further discussion should you want to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with this presentation. I think everybody can see it because it appears you can. So, all right, excellent. So a little bit about me. If you want to know about me, you can just Google me. I want to talk to you and take this time about to talk to you a little bit about human trafficking. I am a research professor, ex-law enforcement. Now I work with this global nonprofit that is called Hope for Justice. Hope for Justice was founded in the United Kingdom, but we are global. We have over 48 offices across 5 continents. We exist to bring an end to modern day slavery by prevention, rescuing, restore, and reform. What we mean by prevention is by education. We know that education brings awareness to this problem, and we know that awareness will lead to rescues. And so when we talk about preventative measures, that's what we talk about. We also talk about rescuing victims. We have a team of licensed private investigators that work directly hand in hand with law enforcement to go out and rescue victims who might be in the perils of trafficking. We also look to restore lives. We have aftercare centers where we rehabilitate victims of human trafficking. We know that these victims have suffered from a broad spectrum of traumatic abuse, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological, but the spectrum is so broad that they have to have their lives restored as best as possible. And then we also look to reform society. And what do I mean by reform society? We look to change the laws. We look to increase the penalties against these traffickers. Not only are we concerned about rescuing the victims and getting the victims safe, we want to make sure that the laws are punitive enough so that nobody wants to do this to anyone. So when we talk about modern day slavery, we talk about human trafficking, like, what do you know about it? Like, the facts are really overwhelming when we look at some of these facts. When I talk to people about the facts, sometimes you see that people's jaws just drop when we see that 25 million victims on a global scale, 25 million. We're in 2021, and there's 25 million victims of human trafficking. 5 million of those are forced into sexual exploitation. And here's why. It's a $150 billion a year business. $150 billion a year business. So when I talk about these statistics, I want you to know that statistics, being a professor, I can tell you that statistics really are only good as the information is reported. So understand when we look at stats that in my personal opinion, I do not think that we really have a good handle on human trafficking statistics. I think that these crimes go well underreported than they should, and they're disproportionate. So when we look at these, take these stats, they are empirical stats. Research was done, but take them with a grain of salt. 76% of trafficking victims are female. I would venture to agree. Yeah. A majority of trafficking victims are female. Doesn't mean that there is not a male trafficking victim out there. That's true. There is. But a majority of them we're looking at are female. And a better portion of that we know are underage. Okay. This is a concerning figure, 1.6 to 2.8 million runaways. Okay. And over 55% of those are female. And statistically, we know only from those who have reported to us, one in three of those runaways have been trafficked. So when you think about 1.6 to 2.8 million runaways on the street, and 1 out of 3 is trafficked, because they resort to what we call survival sex. They have no food, they have no money, they have no shelter, they have no clothing. So they're sucked into that funnel. And the National Network for Youth states that 20 to 40% of homeless young people are trafficked. Same scenario. They resort to survival sex. Most of our victims we look at are typically female. So a recent study, shows that almost 90% of human trafficking victims have been in contact with health providers. I've developed a program along with another DNP, Doctor of Nursing Practitioner, where we are delivering healthcare platforms that are specifically catered to the healthcare industry in order to bring this level of awareness to a clinical setting, so that we know, because 68% had received an evaluation from the emergency department, but went undiagnosed as a trafficking victim. So think about the last time you were at a healthcare setting. How quick were you in and out? Do you think they could have diagnosed you as a victim of anything? And healthcare has become not almost a business, it is a business, but it's such a rapid business where we're rotating people in and out so quickly that we don't really have time to dissect if they are human trafficking victims. So we aim to bring a better awareness to that. Also, according to Polaris's recent stats, Latinos are disproportionately represented among human trafficking victims, both in the sex industry and in the labor industry. And the same study, although we do lack, and I want you to understand that we do lack credible numbers that prove this, but we do know that people of color are disproportionately represented and victimized in sex trafficking as well. One of the most recent studies done by the University of Ohio, which was done in 2020, called for more research. And the fact is, I think after we see this next year go by, when we look at particularly the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that's with it, but that is going to come with it, I think you're going to see a lot of these statistics changed. And when we look at this, we have all these children and youth at home now during COVID. You have people at home working from home now. And if you can even think that this is possible, that more of our youth are spending more time online. And when they're spending more time online, it puts them basically in a vulnerable situation and easily victims of human trafficking exploitation. Now, human trafficking is the second fastest growing crime. And people say, why? And I'm like, it's simple economics. You can only sell that drug once, but you can resell that girl or that boy over and over and over again. They are a reusable commodity to these traffickers. So when we talk about that, we know that the drug's gone. The traffickers know that. Drug dealers know that. So if they're doing this to exploit, to make money, then obviously they look at the better business model is being a trafficking victim. So when we look at this from the United States as a whole, you can kind of look at where you are, where you might be located, maybe where you're from, and see where your state ranks according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. These are reported cases and ranked. But you also have to think about this when we talk about it from a statistics standpoint of view. Also, too, it's going to be higher when we look at population density. So clearly when you say, oh, California, well, think about the population density. Think about the vulnerable population that's in California. You've got not only the variable of having a border there, also having a high population there. So you got several different variables in there that make it what it is. And if you look over here on the East Coast, we notice that we can see that there is a lot more trafficking happening in the East Coast corridor than anywhere else. So what is human trafficking? I work with a lot of prosecutors, and they say that the hardest thing to do is to convince a jury that human trafficking is not the movie Taken. Okay. you have to go by the pure definition of human trafficking. And if we look at the Department of State, who develops the Trafficking in Persons report, it's very similar to everybody else's definition, whether FBI, Homeland Security, whatever. But the recruitment, harboring, the transportation of a victim. But simply put, really, it's through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. You don't really necessarily have to have all three. You can have just one of the three. And when we talk about this, people are like, well, this is what I really hate hearing. Well, she's addicted to drugs. That doesn't make her any less a victim. And in fact, most of the time, the traffickers want these individuals to be addicted to drug, because then they can use those drugs as a means of controlling that individual. So yes, the courts do look at that as a means of force, fraud, and coercion. So when we look at human trafficking, a lot of people think of just a couple of them. They only really think about sex exploitation or labor exploitation. But there's also two: forced marriage, domestic servitude, criminal activity, organ harvesting, if you can even think about that. It's just crazy. But I'll tell you a little quick story on domestic servitude. We had received a call on our hotline from a nurse who was evaluating a patient who had come in, who was 78 years of age. She was originally from the Philippines. She had been in the United States for 37 years. She came to the U.S. to become a nanny for this family. And when she got here, the nanny position, she legitimately did raise the two kids that the family had, but the family kept her after the two kids were raised. They kept her documents. They forced her to sleep on the floor in the basement. She was only fed the food that was left over from the meals that day. She had suffered vertigo, malnourished, passed out. They took her to the hospital. The nurse, fortunately, had received human trafficking training. She contacted us. We intervened in the situation. We were able to get this woman safe, but I want you to understand, she was 78 years of age. 78. She had been a domestic slave for 37 years. How do you give somebody 37 years of their life back? That's pretty difficult to do. It's very difficult to restore that into something, into somebody's life. Hard to rehabilitate that. And it breaks my heart every time I think about that story. So domestic servitude does happen, and it's the hardest to detect, because what are you going to do? Go knock on everybody's door and ask them, hey, do you have somebody living here that you don't want anybody else to know about? So yeah, it does happen aside from those. So, I always say this, we abolished slavery 150 years ago, but yet we didn't have an act to protect people from modern day slavery until 2000. Right. So until 2000, we came up with the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And when we look at this, we can basically dissect sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And it's simply compelling someone to work or engage in sex acts through the use of force, fraud, and coercion. Okay. Force, fraud, and coercion. Now, how is child sex trafficking different? A child can't give consent, regardless of whether they're prostituting themselves out for free will or not. A child cannot give consent. It's automatically, by law, classified as human trafficking. The media really shapes how we think on human trafficking. I would venture to guess everybody here has probably seen Taken, or most everybody has seen the movie Taken. Taken 1, Taken 2, Taken 3. Liam Neeson can't do a 4 because I don't think they can put him in a walker to do the forced shooting of this. But when you look at it, abductions for human trafficking are rare. That's not the norm. The norm for human trafficking is not somebody being abducted, taken to another country, and then auctioning them off in the basement of somebody's house. That's just not it. Okay, a majority of this are individuals who fit the victimization, which we'll go through, and we'll talk about what funnels somebody into, what pulls them into this situation. Because when we look at trafficking, you look at it like you do anything else. It's like, if this is what's causing people to be trafficked, how do we block those so that they don't become trafficked? Because this is really not just a problem for me or a problem for the police or a problem for the government. This is a problem for all of us. This is a humanitarian issue, that we would allow another person, another human being, to be sold for sex or labor or anything for that matter. So what are some of these misconceptions that we talk about? Because there's a lot of myths that kind of surround human trafficking. People think it's only a crime that involves foreigners. It doesn't happen, to U.S. citizens, but that's not true. Statistically, we know over 80% are identified as U.S. citizens. Now, we know that number can be skewed based on the fact that people who might be illegal immigrants fail to identify themselves as trafficking victims for fear that they'll get sent back to their home country or what have you. It requires foreign or interstate travel. Not true. People can be trafficked in the same city they were born in and grow up in. You don't have to go anywhere to be trafficked. It's only related to the sex industry. Well, that's not true, because we just went over the fact that domestic servitude, organ harvesting, criminal activity, all that exists. If they get paid, they're not victims. That's not true either. There's a lot of people who will get paid. In fact, we had an investigation where an individual was here doing labor trafficking. He was from Nicaragua, and he went back to Nicaragua, and he brought back several individuals with him and provided them a place to stay. And he did pay them, but then he also charged them to use the washing machine, to use the dryer, to use the refrigerator, to use the outlet, to use the TV, to use the shower, and he transported them to work every day, and he charged them for transporting them to work every day. And at the end of the week, they didn't have any money left. So basically, they were his slaves. He labor trafficked them. Victims self-identify. A lot of times we'll see some of these individuals that say they don't deserve any better. This is what they were destined to be, or they put themselves in this situation. Okay, they put themselves in this situation. There's always a destination city in mind. Not true. Like I said, people can be trafficked on the same street that they grew up on. So one of the other myths that I want to make sure we cover is the difference between trafficking and smuggling, because they're completely different. They're not the same. Okay. The biggest difference between trafficking and smuggling is voluntary. Nobody I've ever met has ever raised their hand and say, please traffic me. Nobody ever has. Nobody ever will. But there are people who want to be smuggled into this country because they want a better life for themselves. They want a better life for their children. Okay. Or they're leaving a war-torn country or poverty or what have you, multiple reasons that bring them here to the United States. And they volunteer for that. Does that make them vulnerable to being trafficked? Sure. But they volunteered to be smuggled. So smuggling and trafficking, not the same. So when we start looking at some of these push and pull factors from psychological standpoint, what can push or pull somebody into trafficking? Each country is different when we talk about this. And even each city, each state is different within the United States, based on population density, based on your geographic location, based on race and gender. All of that is different in each place that we go. But we do know that one of the key things is socioeconomic status. Poverty certainly does affect a lot of people. Poverty certainly is one of the variables that contributes to human trafficking. Abuse and neglected home. Definitely. Parenting or lack thereof. Absolutely. Instability in the home. Instability in their life. Okay. Instability in general in their world. Grooming, online grooming, or even in-person grooming. Okay. Substance abuse, runaways. When you think about that, we know that 1 in 3 runaways are trafficked. So you can't really say, oh, they're the 2 and the 3, they're not the 1, so we won't go after them. Can't do that. So often when you do rescue or retrieve a runaway victim and you bring them home, you realize that there was a reason why they fled, why they ran away. And they probably ran away from the home because it was abusive or neglected. Or they were being forced to do something at that house. So there are push and pull factors. And as we go through some of these individual factors, I want you to think of it almost like a chocolate cake. All of us, if I said, hey, give me your chocolate cake recipe, everybody would have a chocolate cake at the end, but we all have different recipes. We all have recipes that are handed down. At one time, you may just have flour, and flour is just flour. But then when you add eggs to it, it's just flour and eggs. Then you add cocoa to it. It's flour, eggs, cocoa. It's starting to shape up. You add sugar, baking soda, it's a cake. So now when you look at trafficking victim, all these variables are like the ingredients to a cake. It's not one variable that makes somebody a trafficking victim. It's not even 2. But when we look at the compounding variables that people face, then we know that those individuals are more susceptible to being trafficked. And placed in the right condition, they will be trafficked. Traffickers don't discriminate based on age, race, gender. I just told you about 78-year-old woman. We've even rescued somebody as young as 3 months. Can't even fathom it. 3 months. Okay, 3 months. So 3 to 78. Immigration status, they don't care. Economic status, they don't care. Traffickers don't abide by COVID pandemic guidelines either. Okay, they don't take holidays either. There's no exact victim that fits a mold. There's a lot of different attributes that make somebody more susceptible to being victimized. And we know that a lot of these factors come from studies that we have done and through a multitude of interviews with victims and commonalities that they may share. Okay, we know that kids that lack a stable support system at home are likely going to be those victims of human trafficking. Those who may be a person in the juvenile justice system, those who may live in foster care, those who are runaway or displaced or live in poverty or have a cultural barrier. When we look at these, we know that, a lot of these combined factors increase the likelihood that someone can be trafficked. And that's the key, is to reduce those indicators, reduce those variables that push somebody into a trafficking funnel and put them in a better position so that they aren't. Most of the victims are women and girls. We talked about that. Just a fact, statistically. 25% are children, disproportionately affected by poverty, lack of education, chronic unemployment, discrimination, lack of economic opportunity. And when we look at the industries, particularly, we'll just look at it here in the U.S. For commercial sex, you can definitely say prostitution, hotels, motels, massage parlors, internet, brothels. In the U.S., we're going to see more common thread between internet advertisement, and I'm going to show you that here in a second, and hotels and motel prostitution and massage parlors, and then domestic servitude we just kind of talked about. So a couple of years ago, there was this website called Backpage, and on Backpage it's much like Craigslist, and you go to the state that you're in, the city that you're in, you click it on, and you could go in there and find a dresser, you can find some clothes, and you can also find a prostitute. You just log in, go what you're looking for, men seeking men, women seeking women, men seeking women, whatever. And people would advertise trafficking victims on this website. And through the course of an investigation, they determined that this website was a means of facilitating commercial sex trafficking. And a majority of these women were victims of human trafficking. So the government goes in and they seize this website and shut it down, thinking, well, wow, we have stopped it. No more human trafficking anymore. Except, and as you can look down in the bottom, you can see I just did this yesterday afternoon. There is a new website, and it's called ebackpage.com. That is basically the exact same website advertising the exact same sexual exploitation. It's only at an offshore server that the U.S. government doesn't have access to. So these individuals who are looking to exploit people for commercial sex are going to find a way to do it one way or the other. Backpage, yes, even Tinder, even websites like Rub Maps, and I just put Nashville, Tennessee in here. This is basically a massage parlor app and internet site, both, that you can go to, and you can find massage parlors that offer commercial sex. Adult Look. I find all these websites from individuals that we rescue, and I ask them to gather intelligence because, I think it's important, yes, that we rescue the victim, but I also think it's extremely important that we prosecute the offenders, the individuals who have done this, because, predatory traffickers aren't going to just say, you know what, I'm just going to traffic this one time, I'm not going to do it again. That's not the case. So we want to make certain that we get justice for these individuals who are trafficked, but also too that we take these individuals off the street so that they don't have an opportunity to do this again to somebody else's sister or brother or daughter or aunt or cousin, and make sure that it happens that way. So when we talk about labor exploitation, yeah, obviously that exists in multiple different places in the United States, but mainly in migrant agricultural work, restaurant work, hotels, landscaping, and construction. And these are often very, very difficult to locate, because no one's going to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm being trafficked or exploited from a labor standpoint, because they feel fortunate enough to have a job, and they don't want to prosecute those individuals who are trafficking them from a labor standpoint, because they don't want to leave where they're at now and go back to a situation that was much worse to start with. So when we talk about identification of victims, the crime itself is extremely complex because it's clandestine in nature. It's very hidden. Traffickers are not parading around their trafficking victims and walking them through the mall and saying, hey, here you go. They keep them pretty hidden, pretty isolated, pretty underground network, advertising mostly online, and so forth. So what's important for us is knowing some of these key red flags, what to look for. And then it's almost like the see something, say something. And, and I always tell people, would it be better for you to mention something about thinking this person was a trafficking victim and be wrong, or not mention it and be right? I would much rather go out and work an investigation and prove ourselves wrong, that it wasn't human trafficking at all, than to not ever go out and look at it whatsoever, because that is a problem. When we talk about vulnerabilities, yeah, both domestically and internationally, women and children are on the higher spectrum of those being victimized when we look at it. And we know that the ones who are chronic youth come from homes that have a lot of dysfunction, a lot of homes where they don't receive that type of support. So they're gravitating towards something that gives them that kind of support, which could be an older male, particularly if it's a young female looking for that. People who have mental health needs. People who are being, I don't want to say misguided, but physically, emotionally abused at home by somebody in their family, and somebody who may be in foster care, somebody who may be in foster care with parents who don't really care whether they're there or they're not there. They're just collecting a check because they got a roof over their head. So there's really no parental guidance whatsoever. So what's some of the barriers for us as individuals in trying to identify these victims? First of all, they don't come running up to you and go, hey, I'm a victim. I'm a victim of human trafficking. They're not. If they do, it's extremely rare. Okay. Most of them know or feel threatened by their pimp or by the person that's trafficking, whether it is a physical or a psychological or mental control that they have on them. There was an individual, I'll tell you about Brittany. Brittany met a guy online, and she was from Detroit. She had battled heroin addiction most of her life since she was 13. She was 19. He bought her a Greyhound bus ticket to Birmingham, Alabama. She jumped on the Greyhound bus, drove down to Birmingham. She meets him. They go, he told her he had an apartment. It really wasn't an apartment. It was just a long-term stay at an extended stay hotel. They had dinner. They hung out. He got her a hit of heroin. She got high. He prostituted her out that night to 3 guys. She woke up the next day itching for another hit. Said, I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to do this anymore, and you can't make me. Takes a gun out from his back, puts it on the table, and says, you will do this again. And you will do this until I tell you you won't do this, or I will shoot you and kill you. And she was scared to death. She was scared to death. And thank goodness she was able to be rescued. But she was controlled by force and by psychological manipulation. A lot of some of our victims who were foreign victims who are here in the United States have a distrust for law enforcement because of the fact they came from a country where law enforcement might have been corrupt. They may not want to cooperate with law enforcement even though they're an American citizen, because they may feel like they've committed a crime themselves. A lot of traffickers and pimps will tell their victims, hey, look, here's the deal. You've been using drugs. You've been prostituting out. Police are going to arrest you too. So if they arrest me, they're going to arrest you too. So they scare them into that. And then shame on us. A lot of people had just mislabeled these individuals as prostitutes. And there's a difference. Okay. There's a huge difference in that. And we have, as a society, we've kind of discounted it. We're like, oh, well, that's the way of life they choose to have. I don't think anybody chooses that in their life. They may be pushed into that or pulled into that, but it's probably never a rational decision that when they're growing up, they go, hey, this is what I want to do. So what are some of these victim red flags? What are we looking for? And remember when I said we're making the chocolate cake here, okay? So we want to make sure that we know that just because somebody avoids eye contact with us, they're not being labor trafficked just because they're avoiding eye contact with us. But if they're fearful of their employer, they feel like they're being controlled of their employer, they don't have any documentation, malnourished, very poor hygiene, they're being taken to work in the same vehicle and they're leaving work in the same vehicle. Often, sometimes they live at the same address with a large group of people. They don't speak English very well, possibly, and they're unaware of what city they're in, what surroundings they're in. These are all tell signs of possible labor trafficking. When we look at some of the other signs of trafficking, if a person is providing commercial sex acts, okay, well, either they're prostitution or they're human trafficked. It's one or the other, right? Because commercial sex acts are illegal, except for in a couple places in the United States. They're unpaid or paid very little. They work long hours. They owe a large debt. And I tell you, sometimes it's unfortunate, but there were these 3 young women who answered a online advertisement for a seamstress job in the United States, and they had graduated from a fashion institute in South Korea. They came to the United States and they worked here as seamstress and dress designers. So they thought they were having the American dream, and they're making dresses and so forth. And at the end of the month, they got their check, and there wasn't any money in it, barely enough to live. And they went to their employer and asked him, they said, hey, where's our money? Like, we've worked hard this month. We've done all this. He goes, yeah, you have, but you owe me a debt. I brought you to this country, and because I brought you here, you owe me this amount of money and you will pay it off. And they're like, well, we can't live off what you're giving us. And he says, well, I'll tell you what, I've got a side business. I have a chain of massage parlors that you can work in after hours in order to make extra money. And then with that extra money, you should be able to live. And what he didn't tell them is that these massage parlors were actually fronts for commercial sexual exploitation. So owe a large debt and unable to pay it off. Recruited through false promises. Both of those happened to those 3 young girls. Avoid social interaction. Have scripted responses when you ask them stuff. Attempt to reason away bruises. I fell down. It's much like a domestic violence situation. I hit the wall. The door hit me. Or have tattoos or branding. I want you to understand this. Branding for a trafficker is he views these girls, guys, kids as property. And his brand that he is putting on them is branding his property. So when you see these types of tattoos that would be uncommon for someone to have, then you know that they are being branded as property. We know that most of these victims are very fearful and depressed, submissive and tense. They're embarrassed, okay, for the situation that they have put themselves in. Okay. So, and because of that, they're nervous, paranoid, fearful, anxious. They don't want to discuss their situation. If you were to ask them, hey, do you need help? Can I help you out here? They're not going to talk to you about it because they're very, very nervous. And they're constantly looking around to see who's listening, whispering, very tentative. They're silent. They're scared to speak. If a car backfires, and understood this when I was talking to a girl on the street and a car went by and it backfired. She just jumped and turned around and it scared her to death. And she wouldn't even talk to me after that. It scared her so much. They have hostile and bizarre behavior. They don't want your help. They'll say, I'm good. I'm good. I don't need your help. And most of them are all addicted to drugs, and not because, and I asked a girl, I said, why did you get addicted to drugs? Like, why, what gave you that yearning that you wanted to, she says, I just wanted it to be over So I wanted to take whatever I could to get me through the day, so I couldn't remember what was happening to me. And that, like, literally just it knotted my chest up, because I'm like, why would you want to live if you couldn't live your day? And she goes, exactly. I didn't want to live. Every time I took a hit, I was hoping it would kill me. When we talk about warning signs of minors, and it's very important considering this is a large percentage of the puzzle when we look at trafficking. Homelessness, certainly there, presence of an older boyfriend, signs of violence and trauma, curfew violations, traveling with an older male, unexplained gifts that cost a lot of money, multiple STDs, tattoos, unexplained tattoos, and chronic runaway. We know statistically chronic runaways are going to be trafficked when we look at that. So as we navigate our way through this pandemic, we're actually seeing things actually get much, much worse through this. Trafficking cases are up 185% from last year. 185% since the pandemic started. That's kind of crazy. You're like, what? 1 in 5 kids are sexually propositioned online. 1 in 5. 1 in 5. I'd interviewed this guy who was a trafficker, and he had told me, he says, I create a chat and I copy and paste it. And I'll go out there on these different sites and these different social media platforms, and I'll talk to 100 to 200 girls a night. I'll just cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste. And I know that 2 or 3 of them are going to talk back to me. 2 or 3 of them will get back to me, because I'm playing a game of statistics. And I know that it'll hit 1 or 2 of them. And I'm like, wow. So National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported a 90% increase since last year, since the pandemic began, on kids that receive an online enticement. And then we're looking at all of these streaming apps, and it's almost like there's a new one created every day. And this just happened over Christmas. This father had received training through, much like the training you guys are getting today, but it was online, specific for online exploitation. And his 15-year-old son went missing. And he went in there to check his computer, and his computer was linked to his iPhone, and he saw that he was chatting online to this guy. So he called one of our investigators who he went to church with, and we went over and looked at it and started going through his internet. And he was on a gaming platform called Discord. And he was on this platform playing games with this guy, and had developed an online relationship with him, a friend relationship with this guy who he thought was another 15-year-old boy online. And he had told him that he was coming to the area to visit his grandmother for the holidays. And lo and behold, Alex had left his his location enabler on his phone on Discord, and he knew exactly where he was. So the trafficker found a hotel that was actually right down the street from Alex's, and he sent him a message and said, hey, listen, so this is the hotel that we're staying at. My dad's going to visit my grandmom. I'm here all day by myself if you want to come play games with me. So Alex says, okay, cool. So Alex says, that place is actually right down the street from my house. So Alex goes down there only to find a 28-year-old man and a 35-year-old man that were going to sexually abuse him. And thank goodness we were able to locate him with law enforcement before this happened, before he was sexually exploited. But that's how easy it can happen. That's how easy it can happen. Okay, so we know that because the closure of a lot of schools, a lot of people have gone remote. A lot of kids now are online. Not only are they online, they're learning through Zoom, just like we're learning today, but they also have this right beside them, so they can sit there and they can go through their phone on these various apps talking to other people. Whereas if they were at school, that likely would not happen. So they're spending more time unsupervised. Their parents aren't there because they're either at work, or they're at work online and don't have time to supervise them at home. So this makes it a little bit more difficult for them to receive the support services that they otherwise would have, childcare or educational oversight. So when we talk about COVID and online grooming, we talk about look for some of these signs that get kids being secretive. I've got I've got a 17-year-old daughter. So, I mean, I would hate to be her if I was her dad, because I do look at her phone. I do look at what app she has. I do look at who's talking to her, and if she exhibited any one of these features, I would be concerned as a parent. They get emotional or angry or scared. They look at their phone. They don't answer it when they're around you because they're concerned. They're distracted. They're spending more and more time online, as if they could anyway. But yeah, they become more withdrawn. They're vague when answering questions about things. It's important for us to be able to know these. They're not just being a normal teenager. Secretive behavior, non-communicating, clearing the internet chat, clearing their internet history, hiding their apps on the very last page of their screen. Okay, all of these are kind of clues to add up, when you start looking at that. So when we look at this, I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to skip through the rest of the online recruitment. And I'm going to go now just to answer some questions, because I don't want to take up more of your time in regards to this, but I'd like to open it up for some questions if anybody has any in regards to trafficking in specific.
Yeah, really, really curious. One, thank you for sharing. And two, you mentioned a lot that a lot of the work of intervening happens on the front end in terms of protective factors and risk factors. And so what sort of partnerships do you all work with, and what sort of partnerships have you seen be most successful on the front end that bridge both law enforcement and larger sort of structural shifts in protective factor advocacy?
It's an outstanding question. I'll tell you, I always tell people that, this human trafficking coalition that we have around the globe needs to be cooperative, not competitive. We all have to work together. There's so many victims out there. We could all join hands and unfortunately still not rescue everybody. And I use the same concept that I used when I was with the FBI, that I like to liaison and work with as many community partners that I can. Who's coming in contact with these victims? Those are the people that you need to have a liaison with in order to try to put a stopgap in this. And when I talk about community partners, we discussed earlier that, hey, look, we know that some of the most vulnerable are chronic runaways. So let's go to the homeless shelters. Let's engage these individuals that are at the homeless shelters. Let's provide them with some services and some training and some benefit that if you think a girl or this guy is at risk of being trafficking, give us a call. Call law enforcement. I know law enforcement can't be everywhere all the time. It's just not possible. And human trafficking cases are hugely manpower intensive. So we try to bridge the gap with law enforcement by hey, look, this is what we'll do. We'll work a case up to a point where, it requires law enforcement action. And because we're licensed private investigators, we have a lot of leeway at what we can do. And then we'll turn it over to you. I'm not going to go kick a door in and break it down to rescue a victim that's being held in there. I'll leave that for law enforcement to go do, but I'll tell you what room number they're in. Absolutely. If it's an urgent situation, I'll call 911. I think that the more hands that you reach out and grab, the more people that we can cast a wide net. And then I think the more people that we can provide services to, particularly when we look at the youth. So what's the ages we're looking at? High school, right? Teaching them about human trafficking awareness when they're seniors in high school. It's about 5 years too late. We need to back it up a little bit. Kids today have matured a lot quicker than I did when I was in 8th grade or 9th grade. And that's the age that's being targeted. So let them know of the dangers and get them educated, because education, it is awareness. Gracie, you look very attentive during the presentation, so I know you must have a question for me.
Yeah, I was trying to take it all in. It's a heavy subject, but
yeah,
I studied more about sex work and less about trafficking in college. So definitely did not know all of this was happening. I was wondering, in terms of the statistics you shared at the beginning, that it's mostly women, and it's actually like 80% are U.S. citizens. Is that number just because your organization is mostly focused on trafficking in the U.S., or is it really like a lot less an international issue?
Well, our organization has offices all over the globe. I run the U.S. office. I run the United States office here, and we focus with a broad stroke across the globe. I will say that human trafficking, as far as it being an issue, is more of an issue in underdeveloped countries. We have lighthouses, which are basically aftercare centers for children in Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam. And, I've never known any of them not to be full. I mean, we're talking 10, 11, 12-year-old kids that are being prostituted out for years. The little girl that you saw in the picture in here that when I was going through my presentation, was actually a victim in Cambodia. She was trafficked when she was 8. She was rescued when she was 11 years of age. And when that picture was taken, she was 13. And when I retired from, working in law enforcement, I began teaching college. And I would often look on my phone for Indeed for jobs for students of mine. And I saw this Hope for Justice thing. And I'm like, who is this Hope for Justice? And I started reading about the organization. And I was so overwhelmed with what they were trying to do as a nonprofit to try to combat trafficking on a global scale, but also in America. And I brought home a book from their local office in Nashville, and it talked about human trafficking, and it talked about children and trafficking and everything. And it had a picture of that little girl on the front cover. And I laid it down on my coffee table at home. And I was sitting down watching the evening news. And at that time, my daughter was 13, and she bebops down the stairs, sits down beside me, and she says, and she goes, I was looking at this book last night. And I said, you were? And she says, yeah, I was. And she goes, is this something you're thinking about doing? And I said, yeah, Paris, it is. It's something I'm thinking about doing. She goes, well, I'm very proud of you. And she kissed me on the cheek and walked out of the room. Like, my eyes filled up with water at that point. And my wife leans over the kitchen. She goes, I don't guess you're thinking about doing it anymore, are you? And I said to myself, I said, I've got a skill set that I'm not wasting teaching, but I sure am wasting not helping, not doing something about it. I mean, everybody can pray about this. Everybody can talk about this. But I felt compelled to do something about this. And, so I commend all of you for doing something about this, bringing awareness to your group, and then maybe taking this awareness a step further and discussing it with the people that you know and the people that you have that you're friends with, and say, wow, I saw this presentation on human trafficking. I had no idea that it was as bad as it is. And that it's a growing problem here in the United States. It's not going away. It's just like the drug problem. You can hope to contain it, but you're never going to stop it. Anytime you've got people that are making this amount of money, $150 billion, are you kidding me? It's not going to go away. So all we can hope is to rescue one person at a time as fast as we can.
Yeah, I had a question related to the topic of parenting and just parenting at a time when we're so digitally connected. And I don't have kids myself, but I'm just curious what your recommendation is with balancing your kids' need for privacy with having that knowledge of what they're doing online, so you can kind of help prevent a trafficking situation if that were to happen.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we do want to afford our children a certain level of privacy, obviously, and I remember the last time I asked my daughter, I said, hey, let me see your phone for a minute, and she goes, come on, Dad, don't I have some certain level of privacy? And I said, I said, the Fourth Amendment does not apply to you in this house. And I said, yes, you have a certain level of privacy. I'm not going to read your emails. I'm not going to read your text messages. I just want to look at your phone real quick. That's all. And I said, you know what I do for a living? How can I be out there preaching and telling people to check their kids' phone when I don't even do it myself? But I'm not reading her text messages to her friends. I'm looking for the something that's abnormal, somebody on there I don't know. And if I did see somebody I don't know, I'd be like, who's this Josh kid? Why are you dancing in a bathing suit on TikTok? I would be saying questions like that. That's pretty provocative. You got 172 people following you. Do you know them? No, you don't. Okay. So I think it's very difficult, particularly now during the pandemic, as we've gravitated so much online. And it seems like every time you pick up your phone, there's a brand new app out there, and there's a brand new way to conceal those apps. There's apps out there that look like calculators, that look like a calculator, but it's not a calculator. It's actually a secured app, so like WhatsApp, so people can communicate back and forth, and it's like that. So, I think that you need to afford your children the right to privacy, but also still be parents. Show that you're vested, because children. The one thing I know, I studied juvenile delinquency and teach a graduate course on that, and kids want parents who are involved, and if they don't find parents who are involved in their lives, they will find somebody else who is involved in their life. And sometimes the devil me is better than the devil you don't. Somebody out there trying to coerce or groom or traffic. My poor daughter may never get a date. I don't know, because when they come over the house, I'm just like, what's your name? Where are you from? You're always concerned as a parent. And I don't think that you cannot be concerned. I think you just have to be able to judge and balance that level of privacy. Because, I thought in my career that I worked counterterrorism a majority of my career, and I interviewed a lot of people who were terrorists. And I thought that might have been the worst person I'd ever met before. Until I interviewed a human trafficker. And then I was like, nope, hands down, you were by far the most sinister, pathetic person I've ever met in my entire life. Somebody who would exploit somebody for sex or labor for money. They don't care about anybody but themselves. That's the worst person. And that's what you got to be fearful of out there, is to protect your family, your friends from that person who has no soul, who's looking to exploit somebody. So...
So I had a question. Thank you again for a wonderful presentation. So you mentioned one, macroscopic intervention that your group is pursuing is heightening punitive measures against traffickers. But what are other interventions we should be thinking about, or would you recommend to address some of these statistics?
When we look at and that's a great question, Justice. When you're looking at the funnel that feeds it, particularly the homeless community, those kids who are out there who don't have a home, they're looking for basic survival needs. Okay. And sometimes it's a matter of, I even tell people too, something as small as engaging in a boys and girls club, providing mentorship, being engaged with your community. If these kids out there, if we know that one variable is lack of parenting, or lack of stability in the home, you would obviously lead to conclusion that they probably don't have a mentor at home. They probably don't have somebody that cares about them at home. And you being that person that volunteers at a local youth organization, Brothers and Sisters Club, that could be that neighborhood stopgap that protects that kid from being recruited by a trafficker. Somebody showing them there is a better way, regardless, but there is a better way. You don't have to resort to this or that. You don't have to prostitute yourself out, because oftentimes we'll see some of these individuals prostitute themselves out as a level of just trying to survive. And then once they do that, they're groomed into becoming somebody's property. They're addicted to drugs. Now they're controlled, and that now they're a victim. So the pathway to victimization is very different for everybody. And, so looking at those vulnerable communities and getting involved with those vulnerable communities can certainly help. Okay, listen, guys, thanks so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to throw my email address in the chat box. So if anyone does have any further questions or what have you, happy to engage further with you. But like I said before, really want to, commend you guys for bringing me, and thank you for bringing me, so that we can start spreading the awareness around this topic and learning more about it, but making it a discussion. So thanks very much, guys. Hope you guys stay safe and healthy and have a great day.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah,
Hey, thanks, Rhoda, for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem.